Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today's episode is going to be the first in a series about borderline personality disorder. This series follows my series on narcissistic personality disorder, and it will follow a very similar trajectory. If you recall from that one, there's a couple areas that we're likely to go through. Today's episode is going to be about key elements, but also include domains such as development. There will not be a subtypes episode. I'll look around to double check to make sure that's not an unwise decision. I think more often, or not more often, I think more useful would actually be differentiating from bipolar disorder, and so having a conversation about that. Then there might be another short episode on treatment, and then another episode on like social aspects or social ramifications, which I don't think necessarily are as far reaching as narcissism. Because folks with borderline personality disorder often are not finding their ways into positions of power like narcissism are. But again, I'll keep my eyes out for that. But we're at least going to talk about gender and talk a little bit about, I think, developmental age as well. Because I think there's a lot of overlap at like the teenage years with borderline personality disorder, the kind of storm and stress of that period of life, and wanting to differentiate between those two. So those are going to be addressed at some point. And as I said in the narcissism episode as well, be sure to reference my reconceptualizing personality disorder episode. This is where we're going to talk a little bit about psychodynamic thought today in the key elements, much like we did during narcissism. Or during, both with or within the narcissism episode. So I'm looking down again because just like the narcissism episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read right out of the book, right out of the Diagnostic Manual, the criteria for borderline personality disorder. But as with before, I'm going to elaborate and kind of talk a little bit more about each point. So hopefully that'll be helpful in kind of bringing this to life, because the Diagnostic Manual does only like a really partial job in that. And then we'll talk about the psychodynamic components. So, as with before, the Diagnostic Manual gives you 9 potential symptoms. And much like narcissism, also, you have to meet 5 or more to arguably qualify for a diagnosis. Recall, psychodynamic theory suggests that personality exists on a continuum, and the DSM does not necessarily appreciate that. It has this number marker to say like, hey, you get to this certain severity threshold, then you're going to need to, or you're not going to need to, but you might want to potentially diagnose. So that globally, how they describe borderline personality disorder: pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, affects, and marked impulsivity, beginning by early adulthood, present in a variety of contexts, and kind of the same old. The notion of personality disorder within the DSM is it needs to be sufficiently severe, pervasive, rigid, that there are signs at a younger age, but you really don't diagnose it till later because you don't have the established pattern. You don't have the established kind of time frame you'd be looking for to accurately diagnose. Caveats also being kind of case by case. Some are so pervasive at a young age you diagnose younger. Others take into the 20s to really diagnose fruitfully. But if I had to kind of put like a little cap on, they said a pervasive pattern of instability affecting relationships, self-image, affects, marked impulsivity. Basically, think of borderline personality disorder as being very significantly a problem with self-regulation and across domains. So they have a hard time regulating their behavior, regulating their emotions, and regulating their relationships. Just anywhere the world will typically touch, there will be difficulties with regulation. So I think that's like a simpler way of saying that is it's a disorder of, in many ways, dysregulation, a lack of ability to sufficiently regulate and keep to a happy medium, so to speak. So what are the 9? Let's start with number 1. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Now, the notion here, what you're going to find, it's kind of like with narcissism, all these kind of build off of one another. Like, not all of them, but you'll see very quickly how these kind of bridge and overlap quite a bit. For this one, there is this sort of instability within relationships. And one of the key reasons for the instability within relationships, as well as the instability for emotions, is that there's this perception that someone is going to leave them, that some sort of connection, which they yearn for, they hunger for connection and intimacy, yet they are simultaneously terrified by that intimacy, connection, and attachment, which causes them at a certain kind of level to go, oh no, I'm going to do everything I can to avoid this feeling of emptiness and abandonment. Now, what's important is the what you're going to find with borderline personality disorder. They tend to vacillate. They tend to shift really frequently between internalizing and externalizing. We're going to talk about that in later items here. But how this shows up when we talk about the frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, the internalizing, the less kind of vicious or hostile version of it is often acquiescing or playing nice or doing everything they can to be like, oh gosh, please don't leave me. I'm going to be better this time. And they can be very doting partners during this period of time. The challenge, though, is often there is hostility. Now, the hostility is not always relegated to fears of abandonment. Sometimes they try to get ahead of the abandonment, and they will self-sabotage relationships, and they will in essence kind of test the relationship and get really hostile, really aggressive, and basically just push the individual into a position of just frustration that ironically increases the likelihood of abandonment. So they get really hostile, really aggressive, sometimes really passive aggressive, questioning and challenging the other person's like and care for them, which tests the limits. Initially in the relationships, it will often garner a lot of reassurance, but over time it wears on people's nerves and they get tired of reassuring, and then they start to push back. And begin to reject. They call this, in the psychodynamic world, projective identification, that they project their fears onto the other person, often imagined. I mean, there often are degrees of truth to it, that there are strains within the relationship, but they project the kind of catastrophic outcome onto the individual, and they just keep projecting until the individual finally throws their hands up in there, and they're like, fine, you know what? Screw you. And they're like, see, boom, there's the abandonment. But they can't handle the abandonment, and so they will shift very rapidly into sort of a period of atonement and trying to pull the person back in through whatever means necessary. And this ties to various behaviors that are in of themselves sometimes self-defeating. Because sometimes they actually could benefit from leaving the relationship because they're pretty notorious for, it sounds bad, they are. I mean, the condition is pretty notorious for not selecting healthy relationships. And so they engage in different version of self-destructive behavior because, say, they're trying to pull the person in through sex, or they're trying to pull the person back in through groveling or admitting wrong or fault when there was legitimate kind of shared burden here in what was going wrong in the relationship. But then they take it all back and pull the person back in when in reality, some of what they were concerned about was absolutely legit, but then they just give it all away because they don't want to lose the relationship, and then it traps them again. And then it boils again, hostility, fear of rejection, hostility, fear of rejection, and it just becomes a snake that eats its own tail. So these frantic efforts, hopefully that gives it a little bit more life to it. But you're going to notice that this is going to overlap with the other items quite a bit too. I do want to just note real quick that imagined piece is legit. This sort of idea that I already alluded to this through that sort of projection comment, that they tend to project their fears onto others. But it is not unusual that a relationship can be going extremely well, but they're so hypersensitive to potential threats that they will see something quite innocuous as a dire or sort of grievous threat to going grieve. You could deal a grievous blow to the relationship, and then boom, they blow up off of just that. And the individual's like, whoa, what are you talking about right now? So They also tend to hold, I will say, they hold a lot in their brains too, like the laundry list of potential, issues. They have a really hard time letting things go. So sometimes it's not just about the issue that is sparking on imagined abandonment in the moment. It is like 10, 20, 30 issues that they've been holding on to for a while that they said that they were okay with or got to some sort of resolution. All of a sudden, no, it's right there, just stoking the flames in that moment. So that was a long one, longer than I anticipated. So that's number one, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Number two, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. You'll notice, boom, I already hit on that. Like, why are there these frantic attempts? Well, they are shifting often between this is the best person in my life to this person is a threat, or they're bad, or they're not good for me. And it just creates, what is that famous book, Walking on Eggshells? I think, that's a lot of what that's drawn off of here, is basically like you end up walking on eggshells because you don't know, are you the good partner, or are you the devil that is harming them in some sort of way? And so it really just emotionally tests the relationship and puts a lot of strain in it, which creates this chaos. And then the irony is, because of these concerns that they start injecting into the relationship, never mind if it's already a not very healthy partner, it just creates that cycle I was speaking to in number one, where there's this kind of cat and mouse constantly going on. It just creates a lot of chaos. Number three, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. This again ties to these behaviors that we're talking about. It is really key and critical. I have never seen a case of borderline personality disorder that doesn't have an unstable sense of self. I mean, I think it's such a key and critical factor. It is the reason for the fear. It is the reason for a lot of their behavior, because they're just not good enough. There's something sort of unstable and unsatisfactory and just, something that they're quite terrified and afraid of. And this is why often, but not always, you'll find early attachment issues, is because they just struggle with this idea of I'm worth love, care, and affection. And they might have their times of feeling on cloud nine, that they're pretty badass, that they're pretty cool, but by and large there is a lot of emptiness, a lot of depression that is coming along with the condition, that there's this, I'm going to be rejected at the end of the day. What this one actually ties with, I'm going to jump to number 7, and that's chronic feelings of emptiness. Now, these are technically different, and the way that I see them as being different or unique is on the one side, the how do they say it? The unstable sense of self is this sort of inner chaos and just grappling and depressively, engulfed by this sort of sense of like, am I really good enough? I don't know really who I am. The chronic feelings of emptiness, in a way, is kind of like, when that chaos comes to a silence, you can get this sort of numbing out that can happen, of like the emptiness just kind of takes over, and then they feel like they feel nothing. This is sometimes where self-harm behavior comes in, because that feeling of emptiness is terrifying. In some ways, the chaos, this sort of hot and cold that's constantly going on, is far more comfortable than the feelings of emptiness. The feelings of emptiness can be quite engulfing for them. So it's not to say that the feelings of emptiness can't come with distress, but it's this interesting shift away from this chaotic discombobulation to, boom, a void, an empty and hollow void. And it's just, to me, one of the most dangerous symptoms is just in this void, I think, is where they are of greatest risk to themselves. We'll get to this other item, that there's a lot of self-harm behavior that it becomes so frequent. Sometimes people are like the boy who cried wolf with them, but they are still at risk. And if they are really at risk, it is during these times of chronic feelings of emptiness, that they just, suddenly the lights go out. If you ever see one of those movies where, there's all this noise and so much going on, and then all of a sudden deathly silent. It's a scary time for them, and it is a feeling that they are chronically trying to avoid. So I feel like I'm already going into psychodynamic stuff here, by the way. So I don't know if I'm going to have a ton to say by the time I get to the psychodynamic stuff. So just to recap, because I've been talking about, remember, 1 was the frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. Number 2, unstable interpersonal relationships, kind of catty corner to that. And then we just kind of talked about 1 on the one side, number 3, which is the unstable self-image, and then number 7, which is the chronic feelings of emptiness. So number 4, speaking of behavior, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. This could be spending, sex, substance use, reckless driving, binge eating, etc., etc. An important note is that self-harm behavior is excised from this section, so that's a different area of what we'll be talking about. But the impulsivity, kind of sneak peek. It's one reason why they sometimes seem like they could maybe have bipolar disorder. They have these manic episodes, but they don't. Right? What's actually going on is this sort of filling of the void that they are usually trying to get some sort of feeling, or they're trying to attach to somebody. Or they're maybe trying to avoid feelings through substance use. And so that's a lot of what the impulsivity is being driven by, as well as, I think, I failed to look up an article on this, but I think they at a genetic level sometimes have issues with like impulse control. Like the brains they fire a little bit too quick. Which is why there's also a lot of comorbid complaints of ADHD in this population. Like, well, maybe I have ADHD too. And the answer is often no. You just have such a chaotic internal world. It can come across as hyperactive, impulsive, and secondary effects of like attention and a clogged brain that interferes with concentration, which is not a diagnostic symptom at all. Trying to think if there's anything else to add to this. I think just the big key is, again, there's a strong emotional relational tie-in to the impulsivity. There is something instrumental about it. I feel like I'm going into the bipolar differential episode, but bipolarity is like a rocket ship blasting off to outer space. You ain't gonna stop it, and it just, once it blasts, it blasts. Whereas along that rodeo, along the roller coaster known as borderline personality disorder, there's a lot of things that are sparking these behaviors. It is not just all of a sudden out of the blue these things are happening and then they suddenly go away. It's just frequently going on as a reaction, usually to some sort of distress or uncertainty or something like that. Speaking of self-harm, number 5, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self-mutilating behavior. The first thing I want to note about this, while this is highly prototypical of borderline personality disorder, it is one, neither unique to borderline personality disorder, and number 2, the mistake a lot of clinicians will make is the minute they hear there's any sort of self-harm cutting behavior, that boom, it's got to be borderline personality disorder. In the stats world, we talk about like there's a sensitivity to borderline personality disorder when we examine cutting behavior, but it's not specific to borderline personality disorder. And so people will make this error quite a bit. Are they wrong often? If there's a bunch of cutting behavior, is it commonly borderline personality disorder? Of course. Well, I shouldn't say of course, that sounds bad. Yes, there it very likely is somewhere in the vicinity of that. But it's dangerous to assume just because there's cutting behavior, it's got to be borderline personality disorder. And notice they don't even specifically say cutting. They use self-mutilating behavior, but it doesn't have to be cutting. There's lots of ways to engage in self-harm. Burning, scratching, all sorts of stuff that aren't based solely in anxiety, like I always mispronounce it, trichotillomania or anything like that, the hair pulling, or forget what the excoriation, the skin picking, can't recall. But hitting oneself. I mean, there's lots of ways to engage in self-harm. And when you talk to folks about this behavior, it's often sort of in one of two purposes. And on the one hand, it is to feel something. They will talk about this sort of, that chronic emptiness, that void when suddenly the lights go out and the sound stops. The self-harm behavior sort of gets them feeling again. On number two, though, is and I think what they say, gestures, suicidal behavior gestures are sometimes attention seeking. They don't understand how to healthily engage in like, I need help in this moment. And so they will engage in these gestures, whether it's overtly, I'm going to kill myself, to self-harm behavior and like, oh, you noticed? Oh, whoops. And again, it's not, this is where it gets tough. When we talk about manipulation, quote unquote manipulation, is there a degree of manipulation often underneath the kind of in the undercurrent of borderline personality disorder? And the answer is yes. The consciousness of the manipulation is super duper interesting because sometimes it is more conscious and intentional. There is this element of like, I know I can get a reaction out of this person, and I'm going to use this as a last resort to make sure I am not held accountable, or that the person won't abandon me, or whatever it might be. And there can absolutely be that conscious, intentional kind of, this purposeful volition towards like, oh, I'm going to do this. Volition is probably not the right word. Anyway, however, this is often like an unconscious aspect of manipulation too, where it becomes like a inadvertently reinforced habit, where when things go awry, there's this sort of urge to self-soothe, but the self-soothing also garners attention from other people because you're threatening to hurt yourself, which with responsive caregivers, friends, and those sorts of things, like, oh, no, I'm so sorry, no, don't do that, please, it's okay. And then they are the ones taking back and saying, no, it was all my fault. And the cat and mouse game is perpetuated. So just kind of be careful. One, it's not just cutting. Two, it can be manipulative, but be really careful of assuming ill intent and intentional manipulation. It does not happen in a majority of the cases, in my opinion. And then last but not least for this section that I think is really important to understand is people are like, well, because it's just like this recurrent gesture and I don't have to take it seriously. They're never going to actually hurt themselves. And au contraire, they are at great risk for actually completing suicide. The challenge, though, is that the boy that cried wolf mentality, because even within treatment, jumping ahead again to a potential future episode, you have to kind of call them out on this stuff and hold them accountable. And you can't hospitalize them every time they're engaging in this, because at certain points when the condition is severe enough, hospitals will start turning them away. Be like, I'm calling you on your bluff. You've said this a million times. You don't seem to be speaking about it with a lot of kind of gusto and a lot of detail. And they'll actually turn people away because they've been hospitalized 5 times in the same year, and they're not going to admit them a 6th time. And simultaneously, though, that sort of boundary setting for the purposes of treatment has to be held in this sort of uncomfortable balance with, and I still need to take it seriously enough and try to extinguish this behavior because they are at risk for completing suicide. And so it's this really challenging both end. For both them, again, that's sort of like, yeah, there's a utility and a purpose to this self-harming behavior. But at the same time, there is also something very scary and dangerous about what they are doing as well. And that sort of in-between puts a lot of people, particularly non-professionals, in a really difficult lurch. Never mind, can it be really challenging and frustrating and exhausting for legit professionals who are treating the individual. So again, there's multiple kind of subcomponents to number 5, the recurrent suicidal behavior gestures or threats, including self-mutilation. I wanted to check, I forgot real quick, if there was anything on the actual risk for completion of suicide. Shoot, I'm not going to waste time on that, but That would have been good stat to have for this episode, but alas, you can look it up. I'm pretty sure it's readily available on Google. So, all right, so that's 5, 6. We've done 6. Now remember, we skipped ahead to 7. We got 3 more. My goodness, already at 24 minutes. But hopefully, again, this is helpful really talking through these items. Number 6, affective instability due to marked reactivity of mood, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, and anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. This is really one of the hallmarks. Some folks with borderline personality disorder, I have met some that are highly internalizing, and so you're not going to see as much of this. Like, their internal world is absolutely chaotically embroiled with depression and anxiety and anger. But more often than not, you're going to see that roller coaster I was talking about earlier. It is not that rocket ship, going around the globe several times. We're talking like just day to day can create a lot of instability, or maybe they'll have a good few days and then they crash and they kind of recover. And it just creates this, for people who know them, it's just like, gosh, well, let's just see what their mood is today, because who knows, right? And there's that walking on eggshells again, where it's like, I know if I say it this way, that could absolutely trigger them, and I don't want to get into that fight. And people around them find themselves censoring or monitoring what these individuals might be exposed to, because they fear that instability of, like, they will get ticked and bite my head off, or they will get sullen and depressed, and then they're going to lose steam and lose momentum when they've been doing so well. Oh gosh. And I'm not trying to speak poorly of individuals born on personality disorder. Remember, this internal chaos is real. It is consuming. It is extremely challenging. So much so that there is those moments of complete and utter emptiness. But it is, it really just is all over the place. And there are biological components to this difficulty, amygdala, etc., of regulating around emotion that has that kind of genetic beginnings, but then often they lack good environmental experiences that actually teach them to make those neural connections. And so you get this really challenging double whammy. Here I go, porting ahead into the development episode. My apologies. You get these really challenging double whammies where they're already predisposed to run real hot emotionally, and then they're in environments and they experience situations that create the volatility, meanwhile without environmental support of how to manage and work through the volatility successfully or healthily. And it creates this slippery slope that as they continue to age, their ability to self-regulate gets worse and worse and worse, and their experiences compound and compound and compound, especially when you have a backdrop of trauma, which is not always there for borderline personality disorder. A whole digression, but when it's there, it's just a really bad recipe for disaster, and these kids just struggle and struggle and struggle. And by the time you hit adulthood, you've got a very obvious trend that lends itself to diagnosis. So I already did number 7, the chronic feelings of emptiness. Here we go, number 8. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, recurrent physical fights. Now you notice number 6 was talking about affective instability, which can include irritability. But I think what this item offers, if I had to distill it into one word that I think is super key and critical, I'm pretty sure I pulled this from a research article somewhere, so my apologies for not being able to quote whoever really narrowed this down, but the word is hostility. They are extremely prone to hostility. Now, hostility can just be verbal, this sort of edginess and this sharpness that people fear. They will straight up fear, if not like dislike and distance, because they can wield daggers, right? They can just slip that knife right between the ribs and take you out really quickly. It can also get physical, like it says in the Diagnostic Manual, lead to physical fights and all sorts of stuff like that. But that hostility is super duper unique and I think distinct to borderline personality disorder. Like the way I sometimes put it is they are wielding a knife at any given point the problem is you don't know when they're going to wield it against themselves versus when they're going to wield it versus you. And it's a piece of that havoc. But the knife wielding, the purpose of using that imagery is that's how big borderline personality disorder can be. It isn't just like a charged, heated environment. It is knife wielding, and it is dangerous to them, and it is dangerous to other people, and quite exhausting. A little caveat there is when you talk about better organized versions of borderline personality disorder, usually it won't get to the point of being truly a knife. Like big catastrophic moments and fights will lead to those, but they'll be more rare because they're not as severe of cases. But you'll still get that hostility through like a passive aggressiveness or these instrumental behaviors that have you feeling either on the one side, what we're not talking about here is valued, or in these circumstances, highly devalued. And like, I feel like I'm being attacked, but they're not necessarily attacking me. And it'd be hard for me to prove to anybody that they're attacking me. And so in many ways, the better organized ones are dangerous. I mean, they are so good. I mean, the somewhat crass and not terribly kind way of saying is like an emotional terrorist. Now, remember that we got to be careful with intentionality because they're not antisocial or anything like that. Because we're not talking like psychopathy. There is an instrumental sort of internal chaos that is driving that behavior. But oof, when they get subtle with it and they get tricky with it, that hostility is harsh and it is tough to deal with. Last but not least, number 9, and this is a really important one as well, transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So, first and foremost, the paranoid ideation is it kind of attaches to number 1. We talk about that imagined abandonment. We talk about this sort of paranoia. This person's out to get me. They have it in for me. There's something wrong with this relationship. That's, I think, the paranoia that they're talking about. They make all these inferential leaps. We're going to get into this in the psychodynamic section of why this occurs. But they're just constantly on the lookout for potential danger or harm. The irony is often until they're not, and they're engaging impulsively and self-destructively, and then boom, they find themselves in a really bad situation again and go, there I went again. The other thing I will say that's not in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, I point down because that's where the book is psychoticism. This is the sort of transient psychosis, often in the form of like voice hearing. Every once in a while you get visual anomalies and those sorts of things. But they're really, at low organization levels. And what I mean by that is like high intensity of symptom severity. You will get, especially during times of stress, these momentary lapses in reality testing. And these complaints of like hearing things or hearing voices or derogatory things being said to them, whatever it might be. But much like the emotional swings that aren't like bipolar, where it's a rocket ship going around the Earth 10 times, these aren't going to last for very long. They'll be recurrent sometimes. It's not like a one and done. They'll complain of them periodically. But they're not going to be lasting for like months on end or hours entrenched in the psychosis. It's just these little blips. And because of that, they often don't merit treatment. You're not often going to see them on atypical antipsychotics or anything like that because it's just the thing that comes up periodically and is honestly the least of their worries. They're usually far more preoccupied with the relational issues and the emotional issues than they are the fact that they're hearing some sort of voice. When these complaints come up, it's usually like, is there something worse? Is there something really bad? Do I have schizophrenia? And the answer unequivocally is no. Last but not least is the dissociative symptoms. So that was the kind of paranoid going into psychosis stuff. The Diagnostic Manual does not talk about the psychosis, just the paranoia-like ideation. But the dissociative is really important, especially in the present day where everybody thinks they have dissociative. I'm being hyperbolic because a lot of people seem really inclined to believe that they have dissociative identity disorder, and the word dissociation is like taken off. Like, I can't tell you how many people I talk to now professionally were like, oh yeah, I'm dissociating a lot. I'm like, I swear 5-10 years ago, I was not fielding this word every other person I'm seeing. And yet here we are, where this is coming up all over the place. Now, one of the incorrect inferences here, which I alluded to earlier, is, well, clearly they're dissociating a lot because trauma causes borderline personality disorder. And it's like, yes and no. On the one hand, trauma rates can be quite high. Now, this could be big T trauma, full-blown PTSD, especially we talk about complex PTSD, which is not in the diagnostic manual, but is sort of protracted, repeated early childhood traumas. But it can also be related to non-big T, like just attachment issues, like a lot of issues with parents just not being up to the challenge, and or being just not great parents, not abusive necessarily, not in the traditional like PTSD versions of abuse, but just emotionally and psychologically just unsupportive, and just not really. Let me walk that back. Abuse is a subjective term. A lot of people consider their that sort of behavior, emotional neglect, and those sorts of things as abusive. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, you can have pretty decent parents that just aren't up to the challenge for borderline personality disorder, and they can still have these issues. Absolutely. I'm not absolving parents of the responsibility here, the extra responsibility if someone is showing these trends or tendencies, and I'm absolutely not saying that there aren't a lot of cases that have attachment issues and adversity and straight up traumas that are inflaming and making this problem a lot worse. But anyway, getting to the point. These dissociative symptoms usually come around that emptiness piece that I was talking about. Like they're everything's on fire until all of a sudden, poof, fire goes away and it's dark, and they will just boom numb out and lose track of time and lose touch with their emotions, and they just kind of go about their days. This is sometimes where self-destructive behavior can occur as well. Not always, but sometimes they will talk about like blacking out or not really remembering things, and as an external human being, you might feel when you get kind of tired of the antics, like how conveniently this is when they tend to self-sabotage. But straight up, they can go from this like engulfed hyper attunement to zoned out, just not connected with what is going on around them. And that doesn't mean you have dissociative identity disorder. We're all capable of dissociation. Under extreme stress, we will dissociate from things all the time. When people die in our lives or we get into bad car accidents, it's very common for us to just kind of, I cannot deal with that right now. And so we suppress in a way, we push away from experiencing things to protect ourselves. The problem and the challenge with borderline personality disorders is that they will over leverage this and it becomes extreme. And so while you have this vacillation between this like hot and cold, hostile, depressive, and anxiously inclined, they will sometimes go to the middle and just zap out. I keep saying weird Z words, zone out, just... They don't experience much, and there's a disconnect from self states, which is getting into psychodynamic. So my goodness, that's 38 minutes on just 9, but it's such a complicated condition. Hopefully it has been helpful to hear me talk through these 9, and I'll go through, I think, pretty quickly because I've already mentioned a lot of the psychodynamic stuff amidst these 9, but just to recap. Number 1, frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. I'm going to shorten these. 2, unstable relationships. 3, unstable identity. 4, impulsivity. 5, self-harm and suicidal gestures or behaviors. 6, affective instability. 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. 8, anger, aka what I call hostility. And number 9, transient paranoia, dissociative symptoms, or like I added was the transient psychoticism sort of stuff. So that are the key elements of borderline personality disorder per the diagnostic manual. So what is the psychodynamic, what do they have to add? Well, one, let me note that this sort of personality stuff, the origins of it have been in psychodynamic literature. So they obviously have a lot to offer. However, the kind of cool thing is for to the credit of the Diagnostic Manual, and I will not say this for numerous future personality disorders, there's a ton of overlap. They got it pretty spot on. The major difference being the more continuum mindset versus the Diagnostic Manuals, the DSM's version of just like categorically you have it or you don't. I think that's one of the key differences. But otherwise, ton of overlap and pretty much agreement on most of the symptoms. I'll add what I can here of a little bit of extra nuance. Again, possibly already discussed in some ways indirectly as we went through those 9. So there's really nothing distinctly unique. The psychodynamic folks might use different terms. A good example is this term called splitting. When you talked about that, the sort of vacillations between hostility and depressive anxiety and engulfment in relationships to either pushing away self-destructive or fears of abandonment. The splitting is this idea of going between extreme representations of concepts, that they lack balance. There is no gray, or I shouldn't say no, there's very little gray for them. It is all about the black and the white. And they struggle moving between those two. And so that's kind of a unique term that psychodynamic people talk about. And with that, their internal worlds are very much aligned about a sense of cohesion, like I'm collecting myself together because there's this strong yearning to be somebody who doesn't feel so broken and damaged or evil even. And so these very legitimate and very honorable attempts to collect oneself together and create cohesion. And often that cohesion dangerously is seen to be achieved through the relationship with other people. But the challenge is they lack the relational chops often to get into healthy relationships to help them with that very cohesion. Never mind, a lot of cohesion has to be done internally, independent of other people. It is they are a perfect reflection of the relational dilemma that we all face. That borderline personality disorder is an extreme version of an inner tension that we all have. That we want to individuate in some ways. We want to be our own person, independent of other people, yet we rely on other people to help give us a sense of who we are. But because there is this massive kind of just hole and emptiness, or a different way of saying a sense of self that is like fragmented. You think like in a sci-fi movie, a planet that's kind of exploded away, but the parts are still kind of floating around. It's like maybe there's a gravitational pull, but they can't quite form back into a complete planet. That it's just it is a very challenging experience because they're just like, I want to get it together. I need this, and I'm gonna try to get in this relationship. I'm gonna try to get this job, and they just can't hold it together long enough because their fears and their insecurities and their low self-worth and some of these kind of compulsive drives towards self-destruction when they get close to success, and then poof, it fragments again. And so it's just like this like a Groundhog's Day thing of like, trying to push the pieces together or glue the vase back together, and then it just inevitably fragments again. And this is again speaking to that this is not like as frustrating as individuals with borderline personality disorder can be. This is not a light or easy diagnosis. I hope what I just said had a heaviness to it, an emotional heaviness and weight to it, because that is the weight. That is that sort of just kind of emotion bomb that they chronically avoid, but is constantly just like, just shooting out through the cracks. It is not a fun place to be in for these individuals. Yeah, I'll leave there. I felt heavy in that moment. I was trying to see if there's anything else on the list here. It's redundant, but just to emphasize that comorbidity is incredibly high. That's often when I meet people with like true blue, pretty severe borderline personality disorder. I don't give a lot of comorbid conditions diagnostically because depression is part and parcel to the condition. anxiety and this sort of generalized tendency to worry about things. A little bit more emphasis on relationships than anything for folks with borderline personality disorder. But I'm not going to give a generalized anxiety disorder as well, unless truly it's somehow operating completely independently of the condition. I mean, there's just so many mood components to the condition. It's important to note that they tend to catastrophize a ton about life. Doesn't make it generalized anxiety disorder as well. Is there any harm in giving a comorbid condition? Of course not. But I think it's just important for people both with the condition and folks looking on the outside in to understand that that's just part and parcel to the diagnosis. The relational piece, I will say, if there's a thing that it's been alluded to already. But what I consider the quote unquote mind killer for borderline personality disorder is intimacy. Intimacy is greatly feared and so desperately wanted at the same time. And so oftentimes you will get with borderline personality disorder, not always, if anxiety and adverse experiences really pull them away relationally, they will often be very relationally disengaged, which is extremely troubling for them because they really want to get out. And it's dangerous, though, too, because then they'll just kind of glom on to whatever their small sample is rather than going out there and trying to test and find more people. But they will often go out socially seeking some sort of connection. And sometimes they can be quite successful on the front end when intimacy is not required, because they can be lively and outgoing. If they're having a good day, good week, good month, they can really be life of the party and lots of fun. And that's them really putting forward their best foot. Putting forward the best foot? Is that right? Best foot forward? Yeah, that's right. My phrases are off today. They put their best foot forward, but then the minute intimacy enters into the fray, it's terrifying, and they will try to hold it together as long as they can, but those fears will begin to consume them and encourage an ineffectiveness on top of a potential lack of practice in positive, healthy relationships. And think about it, like, we screw up relationships all the time as human beings. But the ideal is if we're healthy enough, we're getting close approximations to health from which we can draw inferences and grow from. The challenge with borderline personality disorders is it often is so destructive and things are falling apart so much that they don't get far enough to glean how to be more effective, and then it just gets into this pattern of basically ineffectiveness. That's why therapy is often so important, because they act as a third eye, an observing ego, using psychodynamic terms, an auxiliary ego to the observing ego, to help people see and extract more useful lessons that they can build upon, and also troubleshoot with providers to get to a healthier state of being. So intimacy is the mind killer often for these individuals. Last but not least, I alluded to it earlier, cognitively, that there are deficits in what we call, I forget if mentalization also includes oneself. Maybe metacognition is what I'm looking for, but there are these issues with understanding cause and effect. And so internally, their own internal world, their ability to introspect and understand their own emotions is often quite poor. It's this idea that there's these sudden experiences of affect and a really difficult and challenging time identifying where the living hell that emotion just came from. And this can even extend behaviorally of like, I did that, but you ask them to slow down time, be like, whoa, how'd you get there? They will legitimately, it might sound manipulative to some people, but quite frequently, legitimately, they will say, I have no idea. This is when you talk about dialectical behavioral therapy, jumping to treatment. They have things called diary cards, and the purpose of those is trying to slow down that process and get them to better understand A, B, C, D, E, F, G in their life, rather than going A to S or A to F or whatever it might be. They really struggle with that. Like, how do I understand my internal cues? When we talk about dissociative trauma-like treatment, it's like, how do I understand what these different self states inside of me are and what they represent and why, like, where do they come from and why do they get triggered? So when I get super hostile, I got to figure out what that's even about because I don't understand it. And when I get super depressed and dysphoric, what's that about? And when I am leaning into happy, productive things, what does that part of me look like and sound like? And so that internal process is really important for them, so they can better identify what's going on internally and use that information to act more effectively. Challenge number 2 is that extends externally as well. They often have stereotyped or incomplete sort of representations and understandings of people. Remember what I just said earlier, is that they don't get very far in relationships to understand, like, how do people really work? Never mind their own anxieties and fears and paranoias enter the relationship and taint really the essence of who the other person is. And so this is where it can be really challenging to be in a relationship because the other person might feel just like barely a person, or that they themselves are like Jekyll and Hyde. Like, I have this, I must be total crap or this wonderful person, because the individual with borderline personality disorder sees them in these black and white ways. And so they are prone to misinterpret behavior, misinterpret words, misinterpret intention, which gets really dicey when you're getting into a relationship with someone who is actually manipulating and is not good for the person with borderline personality disorder. They are often, I shouldn't say often, I don't want to make it sound too stereotypical, but because they're unhealthy attachments, they will often find them, I just said it again, I'll just commit. In my experience, they often find their way into relationships that are with not so healthy people who straight up are not representing themselves fairly, and that just takes their inability to understand people already. And then you have someone who plays intentionally or not with them, or has their own issues, and it's madness. I mean, it's like yarn that is just so tangled, it's in knots. And my heart goes out to individuals with borderline personality disorder who are in those types of relationships, because it's maddening. It's absolutely maddening. It's already maddening. Then when you find yourself in a relationship with someone who is not helping, if anything is making it worse, it's like, oh my goodness. Extremely, extremely challenging. So again, the ability to introspect and understand one's own internal world, the representations and motivations, as well as understanding other people, outside people's internal worlds and behaviors and motivations and those sorts of things. And it's just a massive reason for a lot of the chaos. Once again, higher functioning people are usually, they're better with this stuff, so it's not as chaotic. When we talk about the prototypical diagnostic manual version of, categorical version of borderline personality disorder, it's a very common issue that contributes to so many of the symptoms that we just talked about. So, holy cow, 52 minutes. Let's see if I listen back and want to post this or not. But again, hopefully all helpful and useful to talk through and talk about. Both the Diagnostic Manual, the traditional American Psychiatric Association, DSM, as well as some comments on the psychodynamic side, pulling from the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. So stay tuned for extra parts. I'm going to be shooting a series of episodes on borderline personality disorder, but that'll be it for today's, which is Key Elements. Thanks so much for listening and watching. And as always, stay curious.